Good evening. Rabbi Wolfowski will be starting momentarily. Just want to welcome everyone, and I'm pleased to remind you, those who are participating in Daf Yomi, that we will be having a Siyum on Sunday here on at Torah Or, among others. But ours will be at 1 o'clock. It will be, however, a Zoom Siyum, since there have been some issues raised regarding concerns about an in-person event. So please, if you're studying Daf Yomi, or even if you're not studying Daf Yomi, but you want to join us, it's on Sunday at 1 o'clock. Either please contact the office or myself. But today there did go out an invitation with the link and the passcode. So now, my pleasure to turn things over to Rabbi Wolfowski as he shares with us some significant Torah, and we look forward to hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Green, as always. And before I share the screen to share the sources that we're going to be using today, I just want to remind everyone that every week at this time, 7:15 on Wednesday evening, we study together sugyas from the parsha, meaning halachic topics, background of halacha that relate to the seder of the week. Now, today's share will begin with a topic in halacha that is seemingly completely unrelated to the seder of the week. However, as we will see, sort of midway, it's going to have a very significant connection to the seder of this week. The mitzvah that we're going to be focusing on and the halachas that we're going to be sort of digging into is related to the mitzvah of binyan Beis HaMikdash, the mitzvah to build the Beis HaMikdash. Obviously, it's a mitzvah l'deiros, it's an eternal mitzvah. And the mitzvah, as the Torah says in Parshas Truma, "V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham," we should make a mikdash, a holy space. In the case of then, it was the Mishkan. Otherwise, throughout history, is the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. V'shachanti b'seicham, Hashem says, I will rest in it, or in them, to be more accurate. Now, amongst them. Now, the Rambam, which is obviously a Sefer Halacha, has Hilchas Beis HaBchira, the laws of this mitzvah, the laws of the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. So the majority of the halachas in the Rambam are really about the structure, the size, the different chambers of the Beis HaMikdash, and so on. But early on, in the first parak of Hilchas Beis HaBchira, the Rambam speaks about who is obligated in this mitzvah and when are they obligated in this mitzvah. So I want to share some of the details. The following are going to be 4 or 5 details in the Rambam relating to this mitzvah. First, the Rambam says, "Ein boinines hamikdash balayla." We do not construct and build the Beis HaMikdash at night. Shenemar, because the pasuk says in the Torah, "Uvayoyim hakim es hamishkan." It specifically says that it's done during the day. It's daytime when the Mishkan should be built. Vayoyim hakimim v'loy balayla. That's detail number 1, that we do not build the Beis HaMikdash at nighttime. The second thing the Rambam says, when do we build it? Okay, not at night. So when, yes. V'oiskim b'binyan, we are occupied in building the Beis HaMikdash. Me'alois hashachar, from dawn, atzeis hakechavim, until the appearance of stars, until it's complete night, which is obviously a very long work day, right? From dawn all the way until the appearance of stars. Then the Rambam says, so who is obligated? V'hakol chayavin livnois u'lasa'id. Everyone, absolutely everyone, is obligated to build and to assist. Ba'atzman, personally, and also uv'mamoinim, and financially. Everyone is obligated in this mitzvah. Anashim v'nashim, men and women. Kimiktash hamidbar, just like it was in the desert. Ve'emavatlim tinaykash b'israbim lebinyan. The only exception is that children who study Torah, we do not take them away from Torah study to build the Beis HaMikdash. Then the final detail that the Rambam puts in is the aim binyan Beis HaMikdash doicha yamtiv. The construction of the Beis HaMikdash does not suspend and does not supersede the mitzvah of keeping Yom Tif, of resting on Yom Tif. In other words, we do not build the Beis HaMikdash on a Jewish holiday. So what do we have? We have not the night, from dawn until appearance of stars, until Tzeitzek Echavim. Everyone, absolutely everyone, men and women. The exception is children, and we do not build on Yom Tov. So the truth is that with even a little bit of halachic background, this halacha is very strange, because we all know that women are only obligated in mitzvahs she'ein hazman grama. Women are not obligated in positive mitzvahs that are time bound and limited to specific times. Here we have a mitzvah that, by definition, in this very halacha, the Rambam is acknowledging and writing clearly the limits, the parameters in time for this mitzvah. And yet he continues and says everyone is obligated, including women. This flies in the face of the whole rule that we know, that women are not obligated in mitzvahs that are time bound. For example, tzitzis, the Torah says clearly you should see it, which means it's a mitzvah of the day, not a mitzvah at night. It's a mitzvah that's only for men, not for women. Tefillin, obviously it's also during the day, but also it's not on Shabbos. There's another reason it's limited to certain times. It's not a mitzvah that women are obligated. Now, just to add a little bit to this question, the question is not only why are women obligated, it's also a little bit, how can women be obligated? I'll tell you what I mean. You see, there is a halachic discussion and really a halachic debate whether someone who is not obligated themselves in a mitzvah, could they partake in the mitzvah? Now, obviously, they could do the mitzvah themselves, no problem. A woman wants to, what would be an example? To shake lulav and esrog. They can make a bracha and do it, and they get a mitzvah. However, here's the question. There is a debate with regard to a woman tying the lulav and esrog. In other words, being ma'agid, bringing them together, the arb dal minim, or making the knots of tzitzis. If she is not obligated, is she allowed to? So the famous opinion of Rabbeinu Tam and Taisvis says clearly, the ein isha agedas lulav tzitzis kevon delay mifkeda. Because she is not personally obligated in this mitzvah, so she cannot partake in the sense of making it happen and putting the knots on the tzitzis. So now the question that we had before about why are women obligated in the building of the Beis Hamikdash becomes really twofold. Not only why are they obligated, sort of how can they be obligated? If the Torah does not, put mitzvahs that are time bound on women, why in this case are we not only telling them to, but we're saying that they must? They must take part in building the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash. So that's question number one on this halacha. It's sort of a question that pops out as soon as we read the halacha. Let's go along. There are other questions as well that I would like to ask, and just another two questions before we get connected to the parsha. The next question is that in halacha, generally, there is a halachic definition of what is considered a work day. You see, say for example, you hire me to work, and I commit to you that I'm going to work for you on Gimel Kislev, Tafshin Pei Aleph, which is tomorrow. I committed, let's say I gave it to you in writing, or let's say there were two witnesses there, that I committed to give you that day of work. According to halacha, in other words, putting aside the fact that maybe in American law, there's a definition of what's a work day, but let's put a 9 to 5, that's like people famously say. But halachically speaking, the simple halachic ruling is that from Neitzachama, from sunrise until Tzeitzak Echavim, until the appearance of stars, that is the definition of a workday. Here, we see something different. We see that the mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash starts not from sunrise, but from dawn, Alois HaShachar. Now, we know there's a difference between the two. Just by the way, the technical difference, if you're wondering, is Neitzachama is when you actually see the sun. You start seeing parts of the sun. Alois HaShachar is when you see the reflection of the light of the sun on the sky. There's a significant time in between that. In other words, dawn is not the same as sunrise. Usually, a halachic work day begins at sunrise. Here, the Rambam tells us an exception. The halachic day of building the Mishkan and building the Beis Hamikdash begins not at sunrise, but rather at dawn. Obviously, there's something happening here. Women are usually not obligated. Here they are. The workday typically starts at sunrise. Here it's at dawn. And this leads me to the third question, which is the most general question, but on the same theme and the same lines. And that is, why is it an obligation on every individual to build a Beis Hamikdash? You see, the words the Rambam used in Hebrew were Hakol Chayavim Livnois. Everyone, you and I, and everyone on this call, and every Jewish person is obligated to build the Mishkan, to build the Beis Hamikdash. We know that the building of the Beis Hamikdash is not an individual mitzvah for every individual. It's not. It's not like lighting Shabbos candles is a mitzvah. It's not like giving tzedakah is a mitzvah. It's not like tefillin is a mitzvah, or like davening is a mitzvah. That is a mitzvah for you and a mitzvah for me. When it comes to the mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash, it's a communal mitzvah. This might ring a bell, something we mentioned last week, but I don't want to confuse. But it's a communal mitzvah. It's something that it's a responsibility on the community that as a community as a whole has to figure out how they're going to build the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, when the Rambam in general wants to bring a classic example of a communal mitzvah, a chayvas hatzibur, an obligation on a community and a responsibility of a community, he uses this mitzvah. In Sefer HaMitzvahs, these are his words. He says, when he wants to speak about mitzvahs that are communal, he says, mitzvahs shehem chayva ala tzibur, loy kol ish ve'ish, mitzvahs that are on the community and not every individual. Kamai, what's his example? His prime example? Binyan Beis HaBchira, the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And yet when it comes to actually specifying the halacha and spelling out what the halacha is, the Rambam says, Hakoil chayavim, everyone is obligated. That means me, that means you. Everyone individually is obligated. That's seemingly not what this mitzvah is. This mitzvah is that community as a whole has to figure it out. Interesting to point out that also the Sefer HaChinuch, in addition to the Rambam himself, the Sefer HaChinuch, who also goes through every mitzvah and classifies it, describes it. So over there he writes, I wanted to bring it also because I have the English of the Sefer HaChinuch. So the Sefer HaChinuch writes, V'zu min ha-mitzvah she'einu mutalas ala yachid k'im ala tzibur kulam. He says, this is from the commandments that are not upon the individual. It's not every person, and it's not a responsibility for every individual, rather the entire community. The entire community has to figure out how they're going to build. So we have three questions and we have one bottom line. The three questions are, why are women obligated? Why does the obligation start from dawn, not from sunrise? And why is an obligation on every individual? And the bottom line from all these three questions, you might want to say, cornered us to accept the reality that this is a unique kind of mitzvah. The mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash is a unique category of a mitzvah. Because if it were like every other mitzvah, these three rules would not apply. Women would not be obligated. The mitzvah would start every day at sunrise, not at dawn, and it would not be an obligation for every individual. So that is our introduction today. Asking questions on the mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash. It's an introduction because now we're able to focus on this week's parsha. I'd like to visit a Ramban in this week's Sedra. It's a Ramban that discusses Yitzchak digging wells, Yitzchak being a chayfer ve'eris, right? The Torah tells us much about Avram Avinu's personality, or at least gives us a lot of information to piece it together. We know Avram Avinu was a ish chesed, machnes oirach. We know that Avram Avinu was obviously a person of emunah, of faith, completely committed to Hashem. L'man asher yitzav as banav acharav. We know that he was committed to teaching and educating others. Hanefesh asher asu b'chara, and he taught it to everyone. You know, he had an Eshel, which obviously all of the details we know about Avram Avinu give us a picture about his personality to a degree. When it comes to Yitzchak, we are taught much less. Yes, the Torah does tell us that Yitzchak was an oila tamima. He had the status of a carbon that was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. That's why Hashem told him in this week's parsha, Gur ba'aretz hazos, live and continue to dwell in this land. However, perhaps what the Torah focuses most in the life of Yitzchak for us is his occupation. The fact that Yitzchak dug wells. He was a chayfer be'eris. And the Ramban notices that. He says, why so much talk about wells? And before we get to Ramban, let's read the Pesukim. In this week's parsha, we learn that Yitzchak and his shepherds, they dig up wells, and it's very controversial. They dig up wells, and the shepherds of the land of Gerar, they challenge them, and they say, no, it's not yours, it's ours. And this happens once, twice, and the third time is finally when they're able to dig up a well that Yitzchak and his shepherds are able to keep. These are the words of the Torah. I'm going to read it and translate it. They quarreled, they fought, the shepherds of Gerar with the shepherds of Yitzchak. Lamor lanu amayim, the water is ours. Vayikra shema be'er Asek. They named that well Asek. Asek means to contend. It was contentious. Kis asku imoy, because that's what happened. Vayachbaru be'er acheres. Yitzchak then, with his shepherds, dug up another well. Vayarivu gamalel. Once again, they quarreled. They fought about this one. Vayikra shma. The name of the second well they named Sitna. Sitna actually means hatred. Fighting, hatred. The third well, Vayatik Misham Vayachbar Be'er Acheres. Once again, they dig up a well. V'loy ravu alel. This time there was no fights. Vayikra Shma Rechayves. Yitzchak called it Rechayves. Rechayves means broad. Vayomer, and he said, Ki ata, now hirchav Hashem lanu. Hashem made room for us. Ufarinu ba'aretz, and we will be fruitful in the land. In other words, now we're going to be successful. 3 wells. Asek, Sitna, Rechayvos. Asek means to contend, Sitna means to hate, Rechayvos means to be broad. Let's move on to the Ramban. The Ramban, as I said earlier, notices this fact that the Torah spends so much time speaking about Yitzchak digging wells that the Ramban is sort of bothered by it. And he says, Yisaper akasa v'yarach b'inin ha'be'eres v'ein b'pshutei ha'sipur to'elas. Seemingly, there is no point and no lesson for us in this story. V'loi kavod gadol Yitzchak. It doesn't even leave us honoring Yitzchak more. V'aviv v'aviv asu oisim b'shava. Both Yitzchak and his father Avram were involved and occupied themselves in digging up wells. What is it with the wells? Tells us the Ramban, based on a yesod, a foundation that the Ramban has been teaching us already for some time in the book of Bereshis. The Ramban says the rule, Maisa Aves Siman Labanim, that the actions, the things that the Aves, that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov did, are a siman, they're a sign, an indicator for the future, for their children, for their descendants, for us. And this is how the Ramban sees the wells. There's something hidden in this. In other words, a hidden teaching. It's coming to teach us about the future. A well of live water is a reference to the home of Hashem, to the Beis Hamikdash. Asher Yasu Banav Shel Yitzchak, which the descendants of Yitzchak will build in the future. And for that reason, Hiskir Be'er Mayim Chaim Kamoshe. Therefore, the pasuk in this week's parsha refers to it as Be'er Mayim Chaim, because the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, the Navi, the prophet Yirmiyah, refers to Bnei Yisrael. It refers, to Hashem as Mikor Mayim Chaim, the source of living life, of living water. Meaning, Yitzchak finding water is a home for Hashem. The 3 wells is a reference to the 3 Batei Mikdashos. And then the Ramban doesn't just do that. He spells out exactly why each one of these wells correspond to one of the 3 Batei Mikdashos. Let's go through it. First of all, the first Beis Hamikdash. The Kara Harishon Asek Yirmez L'Bayis Harishon. The first well was called Asek, contention. Why? Because it's a reference and corresponds to the first Beis Hamikdash. Asher is asku imanu v'asu imanu kama machlokes. Because our enemies contended with us during that time, they made many conflicts and fights against us. The kama mechamas ad shechrivu, the wars that they waged until they destroyed it. So the contention of the first Beis Hamikdash is represented in the name Asek that Yitzchak gives to the first well. The second well, the Hasheni Karishma Sitna. The second well he calls hatred, Sitna, Shem Kashem in Arishan, a name that is harsher than the first name of just, contention. Hatred is obviously a step further. The reason why he called it hatred is because, in fact, we see that Ezra writes that the nations of the world refer to the Beis Hamikdash, the second Beis Hamikdash, as none other than sitna, hatred. As the pasuk in Ezra calls it, kasvu sitna, al yeshve Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. So the second well refers to the second Beis Hamikdash. And he continues to explain why hatred. All of our days in the second Beis Hamikdash, there was hatred against the Jewish people. And the exile from that Beis Hamikdash was a terrible exile. Then he turns to the third well. The third well is Rechayvos. That is a reference to the third Beis Hamikdash. He called Rechayvos. It's a reference to the third Beis Hamikdash that will be built speedily nowadays. And he continues to explain why. Because it will be built without conflict or dispute, without fighting. In fact, Hashem will broaden our boundaries. As it says clearly in the Torah, a pasuk referring to the future, pasuk in the Torah that refers to the mitzvah of Arei Miklat, of the cities of refuge. So it says that in the future, when our land will be broadened, so also we'll have more cities of refuge. So the words the Torah uses there is exactly the word similar to Rechayvos, the same root. When Hashem will expand your boundaries, broaden your boundaries. So that's a reference to the future Geula. Shehula Asid, as the Ramban says. Uksiva Bais Hashlishi, in the third Beis Hamikdash, it actually uses the word clearly again. V'rachava, v'nasva, l'mayla, l'mayla, that it will become higher and it will make the Jewish people greater. Ufarinu ba'aretz, and the pasuk concludes and says, we will multiply, shekol ha'amim yavdu shechem echad, a reference to the fact that in the future, all nations of the world will join us in recognizing Hashem. That is the Ramban in this week's parsha. 3 wells, Asek, Sitna, Rechayvos, contention, hatred, broadness, is a reference to and corresponds to the 3 temples, the 3 Batei Mikdashes in Yerushalayim. Asek is the first Beis Hamikdash where there was contention, the second Beis Hamikdash where there was hatred, and the third Beis Hamikdash when there won't be any of that, and there'll be only Rechayvos, only broadening. Now, the fact that we find that in the times of the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, there should be reference to the future Batei Mikdashes is not so new to us. There are many midrashim, in fact, also Gemaras, that make a reference that Avram corresponds to the first Beis Hamikdash. In other words, Avram was represented in the first Beis Hamikdash, Yitzchak in the second, and Yaakov in the third. However, the Ramban here is doing something more than what we typically understand. He's telling us that Yitzchak digging wells, specifically wells, correspond to these 3 Batei Mikdashes, to these 3 temples. What is it about a well that connects to the Beis Hamikdash? So what we're going to do now is to find out what is a well. And when I mean to ask what is a well, I don't mean sort of physically what is a well. My question is, halachically, what is a well? What is the halachic status of a well? My question involves some of the halachas of the laws of mikveh. We know that if a person is impure, they're tameh, and the Torah says they have to go to a mikveh, they have to immerse themselves in water. The water has to be mayim chayim. It has to be living water. In living water, there's generally 3 categories. There's living water of a mayon. A mayon is a spring. A spring means that there's no human involvement in a spring. A spring is a spring. It's made from Hashem. It's God made, and that's the way it is. The opposite extreme is what we all know as a mikveh. A mikveh is really a pool. It's a reservoir of water. Obviously, you try to do it in a way that has a connection to living water, rainwater, whatever it should be. But it's a place where a person brings a concentration of water. It's man-made. So you have God-made and you have man-made. And then there's a well. A well is a hybrid. Why is a well a hybrid? Because a well is a place where a person digs. We dig a hole, so it's not sort of made by Hashem from the originally that way. So we dig it up. But what are we digging up? We're digging to reach a spring. We're digging to reach water that will fill the well. So it's a hybrid between human effort, man-made, and God-made. And that's why the halachic status of a well is usually in question. It's not, is it man-made or is it God-made? And that's why in halacha it's discussed. So I want to go to visit the halachas of a well. The halachas of a well appear in Shulchan Aruch and in the Torah in Yoreh Deah. And what we're going to be quoting are the words of the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef in his writings of halacha on the Torah in Yoreh Deah. So he tackles this issue of a well. What's the status of a well when it comes to a mikveh? So he quotes the Maharik. The Maharik is a halachis even before the Beis Yosef, and he writes. I'm going to read the words that he writes in Hebrew, and I'll translate. When a person, the wells that are made by man, shemayim noivim mehem, that water fills them up. Afal pisha ein mehem yoitzin lechutz. Although the water does not overflow, spring, it should overflow. No, it's just there's a limit to their water. Nevertheless, says the Beis Yosef, quoting from the Maharik, what is the halacha? The halachic status of a well? Din mayon gamor yeshloi. Despite the fact that it's made by a man, despite the fact that it's man-made, human effort, nevertheless, the status is just like a spring. Afagav the b'teres koinim, although we learned the halacha that ma mayim b'dei shemayim af mikveh b'dei shemayim, it has to be from heaven, not from an individual. V'hani be'eres hey masuyim b'dei adam, and these wells are man-made. He says, let me explain to you when is man-made a problem. Man-made is a problem, he says. Hai b'dei adam loy koy achafiras karka. When it says man-made, it doesn't mean the digging. Ela ahavayas hamayim. We're talking about the bringing of the water. Havayas literally means the creation of the water. In other words, the existence of the water has to be on a person in order to disqualify it. But if the person, all he did was to dig up and the water is there because of the spring, so then it's a problem. Then it's okay. Whereas if a person were to bring the water, then it's an issue. In other words, when is it really an issue? If you came and filled it with buckets or with shovels of water, that's where it's going to be a problem. But if you dug up the earth and uncovered a spring, then it's considered God-made. It's considered mayim chaim, living water. I want to go to the source where he got it from. I said he got it from the Maharik. The Maharik in his words are very, very clear words to describe this definition of a well. He writes like this: Ein b'havayas hamayim shum tfisas yidei adam. The existence of the water is not attributed to the person at all. Ella, so what did the person do in the case of a well? Shechafar bekarka kedei legalis hamayim. What the person did was remove the earth, remove the schmutz that was covering over the living water, and now he revealed what was there. Afagav da'dei adam nizgalu hamayim. Although the person is the one that revealed it, pshita, it is obvious that din mayon gomer yeshloi. The Marik says it's obvious to me that it has the status of a spring, although it technically isn't a spring. Now, where does he get this from? So he gave a good svara, a good rationale, right? The reasoning is because you didn't make it happen, you just removed the earth. But he actually brings a pasuk, a source, to back him up. And his source is this week's parsha. Umikre malehu. It's a clear pasuk. Vayachbaru avdei Yitzchak. The servants of Yitzchak dug. Vayimtzu sham. What do they find? Be'er, a well. Mayim chayim, living water. The Torah harei lahedya. It's clear. The be'er chafura mikri mayim chayim. Clearly, the well, even though it's done by a person, by a human being, it is still considered living water. Okay, so where are we holding? Let's just be clear where we're holding. Because if I would have to take a bird's eye view, we did two things so far. We started speaking about the Beis Hamikdash. We asked our questions and we put it on a shelf for later. We'll get back to it. In the meantime, we went to the Ramban's explanation of the three wells and why they correspond to the three Bate Mikdashes. But we didn't just let that fly. We said, why is a well the greatest representation of a Beis Hamikdash? In order to understand that, we decided, let's go figure out what is a well. In Halacha, what a well is human effort, but you might want to say a divine presence, because it's Hashem who makes the water flow. It's not you bringing the water there. It's Hashem completely. All you are doing is preparing yourself for it, removing the earth, removing the shmutz, and letting the water flow into a place where you could benefit from it. And now that we understand what a well is in halacha, we could appreciate the connection to the Beis Hamikdash. Because the Beis Hamikdash as well also has this blend, sort of this harmony between human effort and the Shekhinah, the divine presence. You should make for me a sanctuary. What does it mean, sanctuary? You should make for me a mikdash and I will dwell in it. Means you have to do your part as a human being, and I'm going to dwell within that. If I could even add one little sort of deal, highlight something in that verse, in that pasuk, v'asuli mikdash, if we read it literally, is saying you should make mikdash a holy space. In other words, with your efforts, you create holiness. Obviously, holiness is Hashem, but it's your effort that makes it. And as we're going to see in the next few minutes, as we're going to go through this idea about how the Beis Hamikdash is how it works, sort of how the mitzvah is so unique and special, we're going to see the more human effort is involved in the Beis Hamikdash, the more Beis Hamikdash it is. The more the asu, the more work, the more mikdash, the more holiness. Let's see how that plays out. But that's the crux. The more work, the more holiness. And that's going to be really just like a well, where it's human effort, it's us building, but it's really us being a vessel to allow the godly presence to flow within it. Just like the harmony of a well, human effort and the water coming from above. So to understand this idea, I want to take a moment to speak about mitzvahs in general. Usually, a person is obligated in a mitzvah that they are obligated. Now that sounds like a very strange or maybe very super simple statement, but it's not so simple. A person is obligated in the mitzvahs that they are obligated means that the obligation is on me to do it, not on the thing to get done. In terms of what you would call yeshivish language, this is the difference between what's called gavra and chefza. Gavra means person, chefza means object. Usually, an obligation to do a mitzvah, like give tzedakah, for example, put on tefillin, daven, is an obligation on the gavra, on the person, to get it done. All mitzvahs are like that. Mitzvah on me to do it. It's a mitzvah on me when it comes sukkahs, to eat in a sukkah. It's a mitzvah on me when it comes Pesach, to eat matzah. When we come to the Beis Hamikdash, we find a very unique status, and that is that the Beis Hamikdash, the mitzvah of the Beis Hamikdash, of building the Beis Hamikdash, it's a mitzvah in the chefza, meaning the Beis Hamikdash, the mitzvah of building the Beis Hamikdash, demands human effort. So it's not that the mitzvah on me to build it, the mitzvah is that it should get done, but how do you get it done? You get it done by me building it. It's exact opposite of regular mitzvahs. Usually the mitzvah is on me to get it done. Here the mitzvah is that there should be a Beis Hamikdash. But what is a Beis Hamikdash? That people should make it happen, because that is the definition of a Beis Hamikdash. The definition of Beis Hamikdash is maximum, as much as possible, human effort. My effort, your effort, human contribution. So in other words, the mitzvah itself demands human effort. The mitzvah that there should be a Beis Hamikdash, let's remember, we're calling it chefza, okay? Usually the mitzvah is gavra. It's on me to get it done. Here the mitzvah is the Beis Hamikdash has to get done. It's an obligation on the community. But what is a Beis Hamikdash? A Beis Hamikdash is a building that comes from the contributions and from the effort of every individual. It works the exact opposite way than a typical mitzvah. The mitzvah is that it should get done, but how do you get it done? By everyone being involved as much as possible. So now we're going to go back to the questions that we asked on the Rambam and understanding this mitzvah and this halacha, and we'll see how everything really falls into place. How could it be a communal mitzvah and yet a mitzvah on every individual? Because that is what a Beis Hamikdash is. Maximum human involvement. So you have a Beis Hamikdash, but how does the Beis Hamikdash come to be? How does it even live up to being a Beis Hamikdash? By every individual doing their part, being involved, contributing. And now we also can understand why women would be obligated. Because it's not an obligation on the women. It's part of the description of what a Beis Hamikdash is that everyone, including women, are involved in making it. You see, women, when we say they have only the mitzvahs that are time-bound, it's because there's no obligation on them to do a mitzvah that is time-bound. But here we have a different category where there's a mitzvah that the Beis Hamikdash should be. It's a mitzvah in a community that it should be. But what is it? What is a Beis Hamikdash? A Beis Hamikdash is v'asu. It should be made by every person. Every person should be involved in it. So, of course, women could be involved in this mitzvah because it's an extension of the building of a Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash, as I said earlier, demands maximum human intervention and involvement. Maximum human contribution. Now we can also understand the unique time frame of this mitzvah. Usually mitzvahs are, it's true, you give an obligation on a person to work for a day, the day begins at sunrise and concludes when the stars come out. Here it's not an obligation on the person. You're not putting the responsibility on the person. It is the Beis Hamikdash that's making the demands. In other words, to quote the Tosfos, a beautiful, I'm going to highlight it because I don't want to read the whole thing. He says, the reason why when it comes to Beis Hamikdash, the description of days changes, Mishum Kavod Beis Hamikdash. In other words, you're right. No obligation on a person on a day's work could start from dawn. It doesn't work that way. A day's work begins at sunrise, according to Halacha. But in this case, it's different. You know why? Because it's not the obligation on the people. It's the Beis Hamikdash having to be done. And how is it done? It's done by everyone being involved. And it also demands a certain level of kavod, of honor. What is that honor? Demanding from people even more than a regular workday. But again, here's the key. It's not a responsibility lying on each person. It's a Beis Hamikdash. And what is a Beis Hamikdash? It has these demands in order to be built. Okay, we answered the three questions that we had. But I want to point out that now that we have this foundation, and again, if what I mentioned has been confusing, I hope not. So I want to just summarize the key. The key and the crux is this. The building of the Beis Hamikdash is not a mitzvah on every individual as a responsibility of every individual. It's a mitzvah that a Beis Hamikdash should be. But what is a Beis Hamikdash? A Beis Hamikdash is a building that involves all of the community, every individual, and the maximum from every person. That is what a Beis Hamikdash is. Now that we see it in that way, we could recognize also why the Rambam finds the need to add that we don't build it on Yom Tif. Because the reason why we don't build the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Tif is not only because we are not allowed to build it on Yom Tif. No, that belongs in Hilchos Yom Tif. That belongs in Hilchos Shabbos. That doesn't belong in the laws of Beis Hamikdash. The Rambam writes in the laws of Beis Hamikdash, you know why? Because the place where we learn it from is because, to quote actually the original source, is right here. Hashem says, Atem, you, Vehamikdash, and the Beis Hamikdash, Chayavim B'chvoidi, are obligated to honor me. In other words, it's the Beis Hamikdash itself that doesn't allow itself to be built on Yom Tov. Just like the Beis Hamikdash is the one that's demanding of us to be fully involved, every one of us, men, women, and also the fact that it should be more than a regular works day, that same Beis Hamikdash is saying, on Yom Tov, don't build for me. Don't build me on Yom Tov. You see, it's all coming from the attitude and perspective of what does the Beis Hamikdash need to be in order to be, not what is the responsibility on me to make it happen. It's a different approach to Beis Hamikdash, but you'll see it. It's obviously it's not just an analysis for no reason. This has a lot of halachic ramifications. One more very general theme of the Beis Hamikdash that relates to this theme and to this idea is a very beautiful thing that we see in the Beis Hamikdash that we don't find really in any other mitzvah. And that is, when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash, the Torah tells us you're going to come to Eretz Yisrael and you're going to seek the place where I will dwell, Uvas Hashem, and then you will come there. In other words, the Torah never says, not at all, not a single time does the Torah say that when you come to Eretz Yisrael, you should find Yerushalayim and the Temple Mount, build the Beis Hamikdash, and that's where I'm going to rest. Not in one place in the Torah does it say that. Obviously, there's a lot of references, a lot of hints, but the Torah never told Bnei Yisrael clearly where the Beis Hamikdash should be. It says, L'shichnoi tidrshu vasashama. L'shichnoi tidrshu means that you should seek where Hashem will rest, uvasashama, and there you shall come. Tells us the Sifri, the Medrash says, why? What does it say? What does that mean? That means, Duraish Alpi Navi, I'm holding here if you're following with me. You should use a Navi, a prophet, to find out where the correct place is. And then the Medrash adds this, Yachol Tamtin Aksha Yoimar L'cha Navi. You might think, okay, we'll come to Eretz Yisrael, we'll wait for the Navi, for the prophet to tell us where the Beis Hamikdash should be. No. You should do the maximum of your effort to find the right place where the Beis Hamikdash should be. Once you have that done, the prophet will come and confirm your findings. Isn't that strange? Where do you see something like that? Torah tells you, you go, I think the words in Yiddish is tappen in the finster. You go tap in the dark, try to find the right place. In other words, in your own way, and then the Navi at the end will turn on the lights. He'll tell you where the right place is. Why am I doing that? Why am I you want to say, wasting time and effort and to try to figure out where's Hashem's home, the Yerushalayim, if at the end of the day the Navi is going to come and tell us, no, yeah, here's exactly, you're right, that's the right place. But what's the answer? That is the very definition of Beis Hamikdash. Beis Hamikdash is like a well, where a person has to be maximally involved to the most that a person is able to do to bring kedusha, to bring holiness and godliness. Once we do our maximum part, the waters flow. That's when the wells fill. That's when the Shechina rests. The Shechanti b'soicham. That's when Hashem says, that becomes my home. It's my home when you do your max. So the fact that the Ramban ties us all with a well is because that's exactly what the halachic definition of a well is, where a person does their max, and yet we consider it a godly happening, a godly spring. Now, and again, this all comes down to the fact because the Beis Hamikdash, it's not a mitzvah on Gavra, on us, every individual. It's a mitzvah of Chefza. It's a mitzvah of the Beis Hamikdash has to be, and it demands us to be involved 100%. It demands human effort to the maximum of our ability. I mentioned earlier one line that I want to return to, which is, I said, the more human effort, the more Beis Hamikdash. Okay? The more human involvement, the more divine presence. Where do we see that? If we think about it, we know that the Mishkan in the desert was considered not as kedusha, not as holy, obviously not as permanent in that degree, than the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim and Jerusalem. And one of the things that obviously are different between them is that the Mishkan was given with clear instructions for its structure and clear instructions for its location. There was no doubt where to build it. The Torah said clearly, Tachas Sahara, at the foot of the mountain. There was no doubt what should be built. In fact, every time the Torah tells us that Haya Moshe Niskasha, right? Moshe was having a difficult time understanding how the menorah should look. They had difficult understanding Machzis HaShekel. Anything Moshe was having a difficulty understand, Hashem showed it to him. Right? We have that actually multiple times in the construction of the Mishkan, that whenever Moshe struggled to understand, Hashem showed it to him. In fact, there's even more. Sometimes Moshe was so confused or unclear about what to do. Hashem said, you throw it into the fire, I'll make it happen. In other words, Mishkan, the way it was in the desert, was so much divine involvement and almost like minimal human involvement. And that's why it was not as permanent and not as great as the Beis Hamikdash, at the Bate Mikdashes, the holy temples in Yerushalayim. Because there they didn't have those instructions. As I said earlier, not to where to build it and not even how to build it. Those were things that they were, in a large part, left on their own to figure out how to do it. Now, I want to take that point that I just said and go one step further to compare and contrast the two Bate Mikdashes, the two temples, because we'll see the same thing is true there. We know that with regards to the second Beis Hamikdash, although there are things where you would say it's less holy, but generally speaking, we say, Gadol habayis hazeh ha'achar min harishon. The second one was greater than the first, greater in space, in size, and greater in amount of years. So in those ways, it was definitely more permanent and greater. And if we think about the difference, it comes down to exactly this. The first Beis Hamikdash, who did it? It was David HaMelech, who had the architect. It was the architect who knew how it should be made, and he says clearly, "Hakol miyad Hashem holai hischil." Hashem gave me the knowledge and wisdom to do it. In other words, there was divine intervention. There was divine intervention in how it should be built. There was divine intervention, as I said earlier, a Navi confirming where it should be built. And therefore, it was not as great in terms of space and size and length of years as the second Beis Hamikdash, where there was no Navi telling them exactly how to build it. In fact, I want to quote the Rambam. When the Rambam speaks about the building of the second Beis Hamikdash, he says something very interesting. He says, obviously, there was a prophecy of Yecheskel. Might be familiar. The last 5 chapters, the last 5 prakim of Yecheskel are about how to build the second Beis Hamikdash, but it's extremely unclear, very unclear. In other words, the way the Rambam says it, Einoi mefurash u'mevur, it's not clear and explained. So they were left trying to decode the messages of Yecheskel to try to understand how it should be built, and they weren't successful in getting it 100%. So he says they did it, me'ain, similar to the first one, trying to add with a few details of what Yecheskel wrote, of what Yecheskel said, because they were sort of left, figuratively speaking, left in the dark to try to figure it out. But that's just it. That defines the Beis Hamikdash, where humans are involved to the maximum of their capabilities in their minds, maximal capabilities in their financial capabilities, in their efforts, in their work to build it. And the more effort, the more Beis Hamikdash. The more v'asuli, the more it's a mikdash and v'shachanti b'seicha. The more, and that is, it's part of the definition of what a Beis Hamikdash is. Now, I'm going to conclude, even though I'm going to leave with a question. Maybe I'll get to give a brief answer, but it deserves really a lot of time, and that's why I don't want to get into it, because I know it's going to take much longer than I should be taking for tonight. But it is, because we're really left with a question after all this. If it's all about human effort, then why is it that our sages, Rashi, Tosfos, it's brought in many places, that the third Beis Hamikdash is Bonei Meshuchlo, it's built by Hashem? if everything we learned tonight is accurate, right? That's the way we understood in the Rambam. We understood that this is the definition of the mitzvah. Then to say that Hashem is going to build the third Beis Hamikdash and it's going to be eternal, it sort of goes against everything we were understanding of what a Beis Hamikdash is. We said that the Beis Hamikdash demands maximum human effort and intervention. But and here we have the third Beis Hamikdash that's completely B'dei Shemayim, which is a discussion in and of itself. I do want to acknowledge that it's not such a simple topic, because ultimately there is a mitzvah that we should build. So how do you have those two together? But I'm just going to conclude with one thing, and I know this answer does need more explanation. And for those who would like to maybe email me or call me, maybe I'll give a chat, be able to describe it more. But briefly, I just want to make one point, which is that it is Hashem building the Beis Hamikdash, the third Beis Hamikdash, with our effort of serving Him throughout all these years of exile, all these years of galus. Ultimately, it is our effort. There is an expression. Where the expression, I mean, they have a children's song for it, but it's an old expression. I'm trying to remember which sefer is the first to write it. That every mitzvah is a brick. That's the expression. But it's if not literally, figuratively, there's truth that all of our avodas Hashem, our service of Hashem throughout the time of galus, throughout the years of exile, all the long and difficult years of exile and serving Hashem, built the Beis Hamikdash, the third Beis Hamikdash. So it's actually very, very much human effort, human sweat, human tears, human blood, and that builds the third Beis Hamikdash as well. I know that answer needs more elaboration, but that's the short of it. I want to summarize what we did today. Today we started off with a halacha in the Rambam about building the Beis Hamikdash, and we saw that the Rambam obviously sees this mitzvah as a unique kind of mitzvah. The fact that women are obligated, the fact that the workday starts early, the fact that it's an obligation on every individual, despite the fact that it's a communal responsibility. So we put that aside and we went to the Ramban in this week's parsha that described the wells as the Batei Mikdashos. And we asked, what's the connection between a well and a Beis Hamikdash? And by understanding the halachic definition of a well, we understood it. That halachic definition of a well, is where a human being does the most that they could, but ultimately it's Hashem filling in their hole, their void that they create, the pit that they fill, that they empty. And that is really what a Beis Hamikdash is, where a human being does their maximum effort, and in that Hashem rests. That's where Hashem dwells. V'shachanti b'soichem, that's where the Shekhinah resides. Once we understand that, we realize all of these details of the mitzvah are coming as a result of what the mitzvah is. It's not as an obligation on the people individually. It's a mitzvah of the building the Beis Hamikdash that demands all these things, demands that every individual be involved to the maximum of their ability. And we saw this also in the location, that Hashem did not give the location of the Beis Hamikdash. Why? So there should be human effort in discovering. Human discovery is really what I'm getting at. Human discovery and finding where it is, where it should be. And we saw